Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast of Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we discuss whatever is honorable, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, and praiseworthy.
Welcome to Dwell on These Things. My name is Brian Adams. I am the Director of Student Ministries here at Dwell, and I'm excited to sit down today with Drs. Dovale and Dr. Lau of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Guys, thank you so much for joining us at the 2023 Xenos Summer Institute.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Really excited to have you. Yeah, we're really excited to have you guys. So I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about your background. I'm interested to know. So Professor Dovale, I'm told that you came to Christ in high school, and now here you are, doctor, teaching at Trinity Evangelical. Tell me about what was it like coming to Christ at that age? How did that happen in your life?
Yeah, I was born in Brazil and kind of into broadly Roman Catholic family, culture, some Seventh-day Adventist. But when I moved to the United States, that kind of faded away. Different considerations took precedence for me. And I think to the point where I would have considered myself an atheist, or at least to the point where any kind of belief in God on my part was just not that important to me anymore. So functionally, at least, I was an atheist, but I think I'd go even further than that. My students never believe this, and I bet you won't either, but I was in a rock band. I was the lead guitarist of a rock band, and I was also a skateboarder. And I broke my hand. I was also a wrestler. This is all true, I promise. I was also a wrestler, and during wrestling practice, I broke my hand. And so I couldn't do all these three things that made my life make sense. And so I was just kind of sitting around, and the drummer of the band that I was in invited me to a youth group event, an all-nighter, which is like the least effective ministry thing. Like you said, you work with youth, right? It's yeah, all-nighters, everybody feels miserable at the end of it, but apparently it worked on me. So I went to this all-nighter and got invited to a Bible study afterward. And there was never really a moment for me where there was like a light switch moment or anything like that for me. It was much more gradual. I was part of this Bible study. We're reading the book of Galatians, and through that process, I came to Christ. And then I was always kind of a nerdy kid, despite the rock band stuff. I loved reading, and so I thought, what do Christians do? Get to read and write a lot. They become pastors. So then I thought I was going to be a pastor. Then I did an internship and realized that pastors do a whole lot more than just read and write, and some things that maybe I'm not gifted for. And so I was reading Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. And in that book, I was like, well, what did Tim Keller do his undergraduate degree? And so he did it in philosophy. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll go study philosophy. And so I went to Calvin College, now Calvin University, and went and studied philosophy and gender studies. And then I was like, well, I only like philosophy to the extent that it lets me talk about God. So who are the people who get to do that all the time? Well, they're called theologians. And so then I kind of just kept discovering level after level of different aspects of myself and the kinds of gifts that I was perceiving in myself, but also where I can fit into the world and where I can contribute to the church. So then doors just kept opening. Theological education is kind of a precarious field to step into, but I got into a PhD program after applying. I said, if I apply and I don't get in, well, I'll find something else to do. And then I got into a program, and then I said, well, if I graduate and I don't find a job, I'll find something else to do. And then I found this job at TEDS. And it's been terrific so far. So I get to do what I love. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. That's That's a great book. I remember reading The Reason for God shortly after I came to Christ too in high school, and just it was so influential to see a modern understanding of apologetics and an intellectual defense that really appealed to me. I found that really exciting that there were people out there that were like that in the Christian faith. So
for sure,
it's very cool. It's very cool. So Dr. Lau, you got multiple degrees from Stanford. You worked in Silicon Valley. And now you are a professor at Trinity Evangelical. So I'd really love to hear about your journey. How did you end up here from out there and doing that?
Right. Well, I became a Christian when I was really young, when I was probably in about elementary school. And that went overseas to study. I grew up in Singapore and then went to the States to study and then went over to Stanford to study and then worked in Silicon Valley. But then all this while, I was still involved in Christian ministry. I was involved in a campus group at Stanford. But there are certain events that kind of changed the trajectory of my life. And one of it was that a good friend of mine from college passed away very young. He died of Hodgkin's disease here, probably at the age of about 30s, and that was kind of traumatic. Then my sister-in-law needed to have had surgery because she had an acoustic neuroma. And so all these events then really triggered in my mind in terms of what do I consider, what was life worth living for? What was I living for? Now, I was in the computer industry, and it's great. It's fun to be in the high-tech industry in the 90s, that. I worked in one of the most fun companies to work for. I worked for a company called Silicon Graphics. We designed high-end computer workstations for Hollywood.
Wow.
So whenever a movie came out that used our computers, all right, the company would just shut down and go to the movie theaters. Things like Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, Twister, Congo, right? So it was kind of fun. And it was a fun lifestyle, lavish Christmas parties, that I remember that we rented out the entire San Jose Arena and we had Natalie Cole come and sing for us.
Wow.
Patti LaBelle came and sing for us too. Huey Lewis and the News just showed up on campus one day and just sang for us during lunch, that.
Wow.
So it was a really fun kind of environment to be in. When Bill Clinton visited Silicon Valley, he visited our company.
Wow.
So it was a kind of a go-go time, And at that time, it was during the 90s, everybody was wanting to jump onto the IPO bandwagon. I remember that my friend's TA in college was Jerry Yang. And Jerry Yang went on to found Yahoo. So it was a very fruitful time before the dot-com bust, of course. But there are certain events that really caused me to rethink about it, is that I spent about 4 years designing a computer. It comes up with great fanfare, but after 2 years, it needs an upgrade. And after another 2 more years, it's time for the dumpster. And I just said, do I really want to invest my life in something that has such a short shelf life? I really wanted to invest my life in something that had a higher ROI, higher return on investment. And so there's certain things that kind of pushed me towards that. All this while, I was taking classes on a part-time basis while I was working full-time, taking 2 classes a semester at a local seminary nearby. And there were several events, several movies came out. I enjoy movies, right? You all know the movie Dead Poets Society, that. And what's the catchphrase?
Seize the day.
It's carpe diem, right? Seize the day, all right? And then there's another movie that came out, Braveheart, all right? And then William Wallace is in the dungeon, and what does he say to the princess? Do you remember? All men die, but not all men live. Meaning not all people live up to their potential, all right? Then another movie came out, Forrest Gump. What does Ma always say? Come on, y'all have to know this.
I should, but I haven't seen it in a long time.
That's right. Life is a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. And if you don't know what you're going to get in life, then how do we live our lives in a way that maximizes the return that God has given to us? And so after much thought, I decided well, God, I'm just going to give you my life and see what you can do with it. And so in 1998, then I decided to just say, hang up my mouse and go to Trinity full-time as a student. And then from that, I went on to do doctoral studies at Emory University in Atlanta. And then an opening turned up at Trinity, and so I've been at TEDS ever since 2008. And it's been fun. I mean, there are ups and downs, of course, but I think that I feel that this is, at least in my point in time, what God has called me to do. So, yeah.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing all of that. I know, I remember being called by God myself in 2009, and that question of what is my life going to be about was very important, and I felt a calling from the Lord of the best way I can spend my life is for what's coming next, what's coming
right.
after I die. It's like
Yeah.
that, William James quote that the best way to spend one life is on something that will outlast it.
Right,
And
yeah.
I really can relate to what you're saying there, because that really made me feel like throwing in for things that are destined to perish just
Yeah.
wasn't the way I wanted to live.
If it's like if somebody was to write an epitaph for you, how would they sum up your life? You know that, and so that thought has always been something that really tried to propel me to live in a way that I would have no regrets in terms of living for God. So,
That's great. That's awesome. Well, let's talk about what you guys are doing this week here at the conference. So, Dr. DeVale, you're teaching our wraparound course for Trinity, and you're talking about race, which is hot button topic. That's it's interesting. So I'm interested in hearing, for our audience in layman's terms, what would you say are some of the key takeaways that you're hoping for your students in this course?
Yeah, it's one does not just teach a class on race, I guess, huh? Yeah, I mean, maybe some sort of contextualizing comments just about how my area of specialization, what I did my dissertation on, what my first book's going to be on, is on gender. So I like to live in that place where theological anthropology, or what theologians called the study of human beings, what does it mean to be human, where that and moral theology, which is like, what does it mean to live a good human life? What's a worthwhile life, which is just what you guys were talking about. Where those two things meet.
Yeah.
Particularly where those aspects of being human that are most complex, like race, like gender, like disability, like what does it mean to be a political being, somebody who participates in political procedures, somebody who uses money. How can we think about those things theologically? Now, the temptation very often is to fall into one of two sides of a bifurcation. On one hand, you have a lot of theologians who say, well, theology is really important. And then, because in theology, when we want to write really long and complicated books on Christology or on the Trinity and these are really terrific books, and I spend a lot of my money on them. But then they'll say, well, things like race and gender, we got to keep a 10-foot pole between us and those topics, because those are not genuinely theological topics. Trinity, Christology, that's the real theology. Gender, race, no, if we give any attention to that, it's only a passing mention with a bit of embarrassment. That's one side of the bifurcation, and on the other side of the bifurcation are folks who really care about race and gender and these other complexities of being human. But they believe that the tools and sensibilities and virtues of theological work are inappropriate for thinking about these complexities of so they'll turn to other neighboring disciplines to kind of give whatever theology seems to be missing to their investigation. So they'll be these Christian theologians, and they'll talk about gender, but really what they're doing is just kind of covering over the main sociological theory or main anthropological theory, main philosophical theory, just a nice like Christian sort of veneer. And I've always been really dissatisfied with both of these things. I love doing theology, robust, earnest, honest theological work at the place where people's individual lives are being lived. And that involves talking to people about what it means to be raced, or what it means to be gendered, or what it means to have a disability, or what it means to, I talk a lot about what it means to have immigrated. How can we understand those kinds of experiences that are so shaping to who we are, to our stories, in a robustly theological way, where we're not sacrificing either theological commitment or commitment to these complexities of being human. So that's kind of how I'm trying to set up my class to think about race. And so we're asking questions. So just today, I had before we meet for the week, I had them read two books. I had Lisa Bowen's book called African American Readings of Paul. And her book is sort of like a detailed examination of tons of interpreters throughout history, many of whom were slaves or who were slaves and then manumitted and so on, but also Martin Luther King Jr. So lots of African-American readings of Paul and what was distinctive about their reading of Paul. So we read that book alongside another book called The Bible Told Them So by J. Russell Hawkins, which is a historical investigation of Christian debates in the 50s and 60s surrounding segregation and integration, and how the Bible was used to either defend segregation or more often to defend segregation, right? And so I asked Mike, and what's interesting about these two books is that the same biblical texts are appealed to, particularly Acts 17:26. So Acts 17:26. I don't have a Bible on me right now. I don't want to. I know we're being recorded. I don't want to misquote the Bible on live TV. But the same that passage was used by former slaves to argue for their freedom. And then when you see the same exact thing happening in the 50s and 60s, those who were trying to defend segregation in schools and so on, kind of Jim Crow era stuff, they were using Acts 17:26, that very same passage that was used to argue for the freedom of slaves to keep America segregated. Wow. And so our class is talking about, like, what does it mean to read this passage well? Yeah. And you have this further ironic wrinkle that, because everybody's like, okay, no, we don't want to read it for segregation. We want to read it for freedom and so on. And then I had this little wrinkle, and I say, well, isn't it weird, or isn't it just interesting at the very least, that the people who were seminary educated, who got a lifelong, fairly privileged education, they were the ones who ended up reading the Bible badly. But these former slaves, some of whom couldn't read and learned to read the Bible through a miraculous act. There's one particular story in Bowens where the slave miraculously learns to read, and the evidence of this miracle was used to testify to his freedom. Wow. Right? But he didn't have the privilege of a seminary education, but he ended up reading the Bible better than the seminary educated guy. So what makes the difference? How can we think about virtuous biblical interpretation, reading the Bible in the way that God wants us to read the Bible? What makes the difference? And so that's kind of what we're talking about, is how do the things that make us distinctly Christian, how do they join up with considerations about things like segregation and slavery and so on? Yeah.
Wow. That's great. It's great that people like yourself are doing things like that, because that's what, when I read the word, that's what I see. I think about like the scene in heaven in Revelation where it says that we see every tribe, tongue, people, nation, right? Like we're seeing ethnic groups, we're seeing people with identities in many of these areas, and obviously we live in an era right now where there's a lot of big questions about some of these key areas, and I believe as Christians we need to come forward and say, like, we have the answers because we have the Lord, right? And so I really appreciate hearing that you're diving into these tough topics, because it's surely not easy. There's not a lot of necessarily straightforward verses all the time about some of these things. Right. But being able to dive into it, to be able to extract the principles, dissect the word, teach these topics, that's very valuable.
Yeah. I mean, that's literally what we were talking about today. It's like, wouldn't it be really, it would be so much nicer if we just had, one verse that we could point to that could just solve all these issues for us. And it takes wise biblical interpretation to get to where we need to be, which is so much harder, because it requires this sort of cultivation of righteousness over a long period of time, which we see in these particular stories that Bowens is telling us, of these people who against all odds were clinging to Christ. Which is bad news for me as a seminary professor, because all the seminary educated people ended up being in the but anyway.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad that you're doing that. It's very cool. So now, Dr. Lau, on your end, you wrote a book called Defending Shame. It's a very provocative title.
It is.
So I'm interested, for our sake, what is it? What led you to that work, and what is kind of the central thesis of your argument?
Right. One of the things that Philippe is talk about the complexities and dealing with complexities of race and gender. My focus is actually dealing with the complexities of emotions. And just to put a shameless plug for my course, I'm teaching a class at Dwell here on emotions and moral formation in the spring semester, so check that out.
Nice.
All right, but I probably did it focus on shame because I come from an Asian culture. And within an Asian culture, then shame, we talk about guilt and shame cultures, right? And then shame tends to be a major factor, not only in terms of a part of our cultural upbringing itself, but that shame is sometimes also seen as a positive value. So that if you went down to Chinatown itself in Chicago, there's a gate in front of leading to Chinatown. And on that gate itself, there are 4 words, all right? And those 4 words are the 4 Confucian virtues. And one of that virtue is actually shame, or a sense of shame. And so that even from the earliest time, even predating Confucius, one of the earliest Chinese philosophers, all right, shame was considered technically a virtue. Because a sense of shame, sense of shame, they're all fused together as one concept. It could be seen as the inner prompting that kind of prevents you from doing something that would bring dishonor to yourself, dishonor to your family, dishonor to your country. All right. So my work here is trying to come up with a way in terms of how can we understand shame, maybe not so much from the cultural perspective itself, because in American context, shame is usually seen as something that's negative, something that should be extirpated itself, should be eliminated itself. But really trying to understand shame from a biblical perspective, from God's perspective. Because when you take a look at Scripture, there are tons and tons of reference to shame itself. In fact, Paul even shames people. Paul says this, I say this to your shame, 1 Corinthians 6:5, 1 Corinthians 15:4, 2 Thessalonians 3:4, do not associate with them so that the person may be shamed. So how do we then wrestle with all of these things? Well, the culture tells us that shame is negative, should be avoided itself, but yet Paul seems to say that there is a certain place for shame. And even the Old Testament, the prophets shames the nations, right? And God also shames Israel. God puts or subjects Israel to shame. So how do we really wrestle with this? And I think that the central premise here in my book is that we really need to understand shame not from society's perspective, but from God's perspective. You could say that there are 2 different courts of opinion, the world's understanding of what shame should be and the values that underpin what you should be ashamed of, and also the divine court of opinion itself and what God values as shameful itself. And so we are really trying to say that there are these 2 different courts of opinion, the human court of opinion, the divine court of opinion, and I think we as believers should be trying to embrace the divine court of opinion in terms of what is truly considered shameful and what is truly considered honorable. And that we really have to understand things from God's perspective rather than from society's perspective. So that I think that there's a certain use in terms for shame, but shame properly understood. Because we can't eliminate shame or even the emotion of shame itself. It's part of who we are. And as long as there's sin in this world, there will be shame, at least from God's perspective. And so then how then can we understand shame from God's perspective and then educate ourselves in that framework? It's a very debated topic because, there's a lot of complexity to it because it really deals with psychology, it deals with anthropology, it deals with culture itself. There's a lot of distinction between guilt and shame too. And that's a whole complexity thing, but I hope to unpack that, and at some point in time, at least in one of the sessions that I have here.
Yeah, that's very cool. And also, important. I think that it is interesting to think about. There are terms like that in the Bible that the culture understands them one way, but the Bible defines them differently. Even take a word like faith has often been debated as something that's blind trust, right? There's no reason behind it. It's just something that we do as like a crutch or something like that. But biblically, we know that faith is an informed trust, right? That it is based on evidence, but that it is also reaching out and trusting God. And so I could very much see why shame would be something similar. Yeah. So what would you say are some of the main differences then between the culture's opinion on shame, where this is very bad, it's something where you're looking at yourself and you have very low self-esteem or whatever it may be, versus the biblical understanding that there is something here that we need to really grasp and not just avoid.
Right. We think that, if we get rid of shame, it leads to self-esteem because shame destroys our self-esteem. But the absence of shame is not self-esteem. The absence of shame is shamelessness. This is what Aristotle says, when he puts the opposite of shame, it is shamelessness itself. And so I think that is something that we need to remember. And that while self-esteem, I think that from a psychological perspective, that's important. But what's more important than self-esteem is God's esteem of us, God's view of us rather than our view of ourselves, that we are okay. It's what's really more important is how does God view us. And so Paul's shame, Pauline's shame, a lot of people say that shame is manipulative because it's other people forcing an opinion of who you should be. Rather, they say that you should be guilt, so that guilt is something that's internal, it's autonomous, right? But Pauline's shame, it's neither autonomous or heteronomous, that means from view from outside. Rather, it's theonomous. It is the sense of how does God view us? And that, I think, is the main thing that we need to try to root ourselves, that we root our identity in God's view of who we are, rather than our own view of who we are or society's view of who we are, but rather in God's view of us. And I think that we will constantly struggle with this, but I think that we need, again, to build our identity in God and our identity in Christ, rather than society's opinion of us or our own opinion of ourselves. So that trying to come up with this proper understanding of shame that is, I think, beneficial, but at the same time recognizing its potential to be destructive, but it need not be destructive. It need not be toxic. It need not be manipulative. When we understand how shame should be applied, shame should be used, I think it can be an instrument for good. And if we understand it from God's perspective.
Right. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense where, culturally, there might be an avoidance of shame, but there's also the absence of the rock solid identity with God, right? That cannot be, that is unchanging, completely loved, completely accepted, completely appreciated. And so there's a little bit more room for dealing with negative emotions, maybe such as shame, because it is not the end of everything, right? To experience that because of what we have in the Lord.
Yeah.
But for people out in the culture who don't have that kind of standing, you could see why maybe there would be an avoidance of shame, but we don't want to adopt that as Christians, right? Too. So
the thing is that, in the ancient world, shame and honor are two sides of the same coin. Meaning that you can't have great honor if you don't have shame, if you don't have a sense of shame. They are one and the same. So that in the ancient world itself, the word for shame can sometimes mean honor.
Wow. Okay.
That is perplexing.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is the complexity itself. If there's no boundaries in terms of what we can or cannot do, if we don't have this internal sense of shame itself, that if we do this thing, it will bring shame upon us or the God that we represent, then I think that we would ultimately fall into a lot of danger, a lot into evil itself, because then shame is seen as a means by which that forms as a hitch that circumvents that God's our actions. And so I think developing a proper sense of shame from God's perspective is so very important.
Yeah, I agree. That's cool. Well, you guys are doing very great work. I really appreciate that, speaking to these areas of difficulty and giving answers where they're needed. I kind of wondered for both of you then, so you're both, professors. What do you enjoy most when it comes to teaching? Right? Like you chose this profession. When it comes to teaching your students, what do you feel like is your favorite part of having a role like that in God's plan?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to sound trivial. I hope it doesn't. But the best thing about being a professor are the students. In particular, those moments when there is a sort of common sense of belonging in a classroom, where the appetite for competition ceases, where it's rare and it's hard to cultivate, but I've gotten little glimpses of students mutually supporting one another, even amidst difference. students caring for one another. My favorite example, I was teaching a political theology class. I actually taught it here last year. But when I was out on campus, we were talking about things like Christian nonviolence and just war theory and all this stuff, and I had two students. One was a committed nonviolence guy, and another guy who was a committed just war guy. And you can see how that could be a recipe for explosiveness. At least on one end. But no, that's not, but these guys cultivated this beautiful friendship. They would go to lunch after class every week, and they would talk, and you see how Christian theology needs this sort of soil that's enriching, that communicates the love of God to one another, which then enables us to talk about these difficult things well. It's when we only have this kind of superficial understanding of another person that it's easy to hate our enemies, right? But if we understand our enemies, if we go to lunch with our enemies, if we know that our enemies are good, mothers or fathers, or help out in their church by taking out the trash every week, or that they I don't know, like made their Wi-Fi available to a neighbor because during COVID their kids didn't have reliable internet access for their schooling or something like. When you start learning these things, it's a lot harder to reduce somebody down to just one thing. Right. So in the classroom, because I get this privilege of teaching really hard stuff like race and whatnot, I find that enabling times of common belonging. When you get those moments, there's nothing like it. And so I kind of live for those moments. And if when they happen, I'm just so grateful. Yeah,
that's cool. It's very cool.
For me, I think that the main joy in terms of teaching and being in a seminary is the opportunity to disciple students. And a lot of times it occurs outside of the classroom and on one-on-one interactions and having them over for meals and meeting up with them for lunch. And I have one TA who's like someone that I mentored, and he would follow me when I go for a conference, that just to spend time together, just to talk about life, just to talk about his future ministry goals. And so I say that that's one more beneficial things to see myself investing in the very lives of the students, that shaping them, encouraging them in this journey of it's the Christian life it's all about. And I think that I find that to be sometimes much more fulfilling than doing the latest research on my project itself, is that we see actually that it's so wonderful that God has given me an opportunity to make an impression in somebody's life, and that that's hands down the most fun thing for me.
Yeah. Sometimes you do the latest research, and then 2 years later you have to update it. And
that's
then,
right.
2 years later you have to write another book.
Yeah. With writing, there's much wariness, right? As Ecclesiastes says itself.
Right. Yeah, it does make you think about Paul there at the end of 1 Thessalonians 2 when he's talking about them. He says, "You are our glory and our joy and our crown." And it makes sense. The people are what make it, right? The people are what's eternal. And so that's awesome that you guys are making that kind of impact on your students and getting to be involved in that and in God's plan in that way. So let's think about kind of the American landscape when it comes to Christianity, right? I'm interested in hearing from you guys. We're in a time of some cultural upheaval, maybe some might say. And I was thinking about how back in the 60s and 70s, right, the Jesus movement emerged kind of out of nowhere. And there was a mass revival, right, for Christianity. And Ed Stetzer visited us here a year or two ago, and he was suggesting that we should pray for revival, right? That's something that we should be praying for. And it's interesting to think about that because our church was actually born out of the Jesus movement. That's actually how we started. And I'm kind of interested in hearing from you guys. Here we are in the 21st century, much later, and we're in a similar, maybe there's some similarities maybe culturally to back then. Do you think that we could see a revival like what we saw in the Jesus movement today? Or what are you seeing culturally that could be planting the seeds for a mass level of interest in Jesus and in Christianity?
One of the things I see is that there's so much polarization that's happening in today's society itself. And I think that polarization is because we put our identity in different things and wrong things. either in the culture itself, in race, in politics itself. Whereas our identity, first and foremost, must be in Christ. It must be the thing that forms the common bond that really binds us together, that. And I think that if we really are able to focus on that itself, I think that we will then really be able to have a chance to speak to our culture and to be able to make an impact in a culture that is now so divisive, that is filled with anger, so much anger in terms of the opposite, without a chance to be able to hear the other person's opinions itself. Again, so if we root our identity in terms of our common identity in Christ, I think that we can then be able to build bridges and be able to form, I think, a united body that's truly representative of an alternative to what society is teaching us.
That's excellent. That's well said.
Yeah. Yeah, you asked if revival can happen. I mean, of course it can, because it's ultimately God's doing. I think for me, the really interesting question is, what would it look like? You know? And I love what you just said there, Taylor, is it's interesting how the most significant and transformative moments of Christian history happened in surprising ways, with surprising people, with surprising relationships that you wouldn't think would happen. We had an emperor who gave us our most important creed, right? In Nicaea. That's like, what do we do with that? Yeah. And so what would we need today? What would a distinctly Christian revival look like? I think a lot of what Taylor said, the thing that I constantly have on my mind, because it's probably one of the most convicting things Jesus says, at least to me, is the love of enemy. And how God causes the rain to fall. God gives life-nourishing care to the just and the unjust. The people that I hate the most, God gives them care. Which isn't this kind of moral relativism, and it isn't this, it isn't like being soft on truth or anything like that. It's a recognition that the world is the Lord's. It's a recognition of the goodness of creation. It's a recognition that at the end of the day, even the person that I find most loathsome somehow still looks like God because they're made in his image. And if they're made in his image, then I owe them everything, right? I owe them truth. I owe them care. I owe them the clothes off my back. I owe them, right? So there's this sort of like, I think it would be a revival of long-suffering compassion. It's funny, the lectionary this morning, Anglican, the lectionary this morning brought me to 1 Corinthians 13, and I'm just always reminded of how so much is pointless according to Paul if it's not done in love. And so, which is really hard for me as a professor, because I'm like, I can't grade my students' love. Thankfully I can't, right? But ultimately, that's what I want them to cultivate, and when I think of revival, that's what I want to see, is these expressions of truth-filled, morally objective love that enable us to envision a new way, a better way, and to see God's kingdom.
Absolutely. I love what you guys are saying. I mean, love is at the center, right, of what we're called to do. I think about, the cultural climate is very confrontational, but it does say in 1 Timothy 2:4 that Jesus desires all men to be saved, not just the ones that we like. So, you guys are citing great points and great scripture, and I agree. I mean, we have to go out confident in who the Lord has made us to be, loving the people that he puts in front of us. So that's great. That's really good. So I appreciate this, guys. I appreciate getting to hear from you. I appreciate you guys coming here for this conference and equipping us. And I'm eager to see what the result is of this conference, seeing people get equipped and excited, and then getting out and loving the people in their communities, sharing their faith. So thank you so much for joining us for this time. I appreciate it. So thank you to our audience for listening to this podcast today. If you guys would like more information, you can find our podcast on anywhere you get your podcast services, and you can find more about us at www.dwellcc.org. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.